Connor, you had something you wanted to say about the bad technique conversation we were having earlier.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm a huge, like, proponent of technique. You need to do it this way. This is how you're going to be taught, and you need to follow these steps in order to be in this line. I think it ultimately funnels down to what are the goals that you're trying to achieve, the goals that we had been talking about before, such as like getting a good sound, playing rhythmically in time. Are you efficient with your motion so you're not hurting yourself? And are you capable of playing with a quote unquote technique that allows you to look similar and sound similar to the person next to you? Because by nature, this is a group activity, and you need to have some uniformity amongst the line of what they look like and how they sound. But I think that, in trying to get a good technique is based solely on getting those goals out of the students, and making sure that they can kind of partition and comprehend what they need to do physically in their hands to achieve that sound.
Which speaks to the conversation that we were having off camera, right? Because technique without goals, technique without knowing what you're going for, right? What we were talking about was we've all experienced, either a student coming to us or watching people play, and you realize that they're moving a certain way. It's very apparent that they're moving the way they're moving because they were told to, but not because it made sense to them. It was just they were being obedient. Is that okay? Like at a certain level, is that, maybe early on in high school before, is there a certain level of that's okay, or is that dangerous to try to, bring up younger students that way? What do you guys think?
I think that so at the younger level, I think ultimately that's necessary, right? You can't just start from like, all right, well, drum how you think, because they don't have any opinions or thoughts about it yet. They can't establish like, I'm going to move this way for this reason, because they might not be coordinated enough to move in a certain way, and they also don't have enough sort of head knowledge or experience to be decisive about it. I think later down the road, when you leave high school and you get up, you're trying to make some of the top groups in the activity, or just march at any independent level, pretty much. I've had students, private lesson students, that had previously done lessons with Nick, or maybe have hopped around to some other people that I know really well. And I'll ask them a question about like, so why are you moving in this way? And they'll say like, oh, Nick said I should do this. And my thought is like, I know Nick. He did not tell you that. I'm not saying that you didn't think he told you that, but you might have keyed in on something he said way more than was actually intended.
Right.
Or Nick might have said, hey, think about this because it might help you achieve a certain result. And the person took that as, oh, this is the correct way to do it. I need to roll with this forever. And it's like, well, without stopping to ask yourself, is it actually producing the result you were looking for in the first place?
I love that you brought that up, because a lot of times students, they again, if they don't have that sort of context, like the way they process everything is unique to each person, to the way their brains are wired. But there's a distinction, I think, between in the moment, in a lesson, or during a sectional, or whatever. Not that you're going to be running any more sectionals since you're caption head. No, but you still run sectionals for Pulse. Okay, so there you go.
Of course, I love running sectionals.
But
boots on the ground.
But personal adjustment versus this is the way we want everybody to play. And a student not knowing the difference between those two things. It's like going back to golf, right? If you're trying to get rid of a slice and you're doing a very specific move to get rid of that slice, at some point you need to stop thinking about doing that move, because the slice will be gone and you're going to create something else. You're going to create a hook or something like that. So a student knowing the context of the information that you're giving them is this an adjustment? I'm telling you and only you. I don't want you to go tell your friends, this is the way we need to drum now. Versus, yes, go and tell all your friends. This is sort of like the basis. Do you guys make that distinction? Do you find yourself having to do that?
Yeah.
To have clarity with students?
Yeah, the parallel that I use to describe this sort of thing with students, especially if I've seen this kind of thing come up, first of all, I'll just say, I don't think that any of us are above that sort of processing. Like, we all have difficulty doing that if it's not defined to us
100%.
in things that we're not
Yeah.
Not super skilled at. So it's not the fault of the student. It's a lot of times it's the fault of the instructor. I think in many ways. But in noticing this, something that I've brought up to a lot of students is, say that you're back in second grade and they're teaching you how to do addition and subtraction. So you start doing subtraction and they put up a problem like 3 minus 7. And what does the teacher tell you in second grade? They say, you can't do that. They say 3 minus 7, that doesn't work. The first number has to be bigger. And then you get to third grade and they say, hey, actually, there are these things called negative numbers. And you can do 3 minus 7. You just have to put a negative in front of the 4. Right? And I think it's a similar thing for us, where there are things that I would teach to a high school group that then, if I have that same student from high school in RCC, they might hear me say something that's contradictory to what I told them in high school. That was a means to an end thing and a what they were ready for at the time thing.
Yeah.
I think there are times where you have to clarify that distinction, and there are times where clarifying that distinction would be overwhelming for the student, so you don't in that time. Then they go on somewhere else, taking that as sort of dogma, and it can be, depending on the sort of the personality of the student, it can be difficult to break those things back down and get them to challenge what they were taught before, and recognize that it was all in good intent and it worked for a period of time. It just might not work with what they're trying to achieve now.
Have you ever said something, came up with, something for a student to try, or you were tackling, let's say you were tackling an issue and like the first 3 solutions you came up with just weren't working and you had to dig deep. You had to go deep in the bag. Have you ever told a student something that you would never tell anybody else, but you're telling this particular student this because you know them and you know what, this is actually going to get them to do the right thing, even though I'm going to tell them to do the wrong thing or to think about it the wrong way. Have you guys ever found yourself in a situation where you've had to do that?
Yeah, definitely. I think that when you get your students to understand the fact that your hands are shaped differently, maybe a concept that I tell you wouldn't be applicable to the person next to you, or I would have to give them different information. They understand, hopefully, that hey, this isn't, don't take it as gospel and tell this to everyone that you've ever taught, because I think that you understand why you're getting this feedback or this commentary. And one thing I like to do a lot is, make sure that everything about technique or just teaching in general comes from a place of logic and reason. There is a reason why you are asked to do this one thing. And it's better that you understand the reason than to do this one thing blindly and just follow with it. Because let's say, for example, you tell them, you're playing really quiet. Your sticks sound very choked off. How about you take your fulcrum, make it a little bit smaller, and relax your hand?
Why would you ever tell somebody that? I'm just kidding.
But it just comes from the point of well, why? Because it sounds bad. So then you say, well, try this, and it sounds good. And a light bulb goes off in their head saying now I have a reason why I do this thing. So if they go to the next person or they have a line of their own to teach, they don't say, hey, we should relax. Why? Because I told you to. It's no, because I think you can get a better sound by doing this comment that I told you.
But how often do we see students and they don't think, even advanced students, even students that are coming to try to be in the lines, and they've marched independent, they've marched other places, but you still see them you don't know that, that's not wrong, but why are you doing that.
You don't have a reason.
Yeah.
You don't have a reason. You're not achieving anything.
I don't think
you're
that's
just
limited
mimicking.
to the people that are auditioning for these groups. I think that's
Some of the people that are in the
yeah,
groups.
yeah, definitely. Some of the people that,
Absolutely.
and Nick he brought up earlier, like there are people that slip through the cracks in terms of like skill sets that you don't necessarily realize until you're into the season. Like, oh, this is a struggle for you.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty universal. Every person has, every member has skill sets that they're stronger at and things that they're weaker at. Some people learn really fast. Some people take a little bit longer to learn. I think that's like, so that it's not to say that once you're in these groups that you're immune from that sort of thing, or that even on the tech side of things, it's like, I think there are some assumptions made that it's like, oh, like the Blue Devils snare line is like 8 or 9 of the best snare drummers in existence. It's like, not necessarily. Like they made it through
Maybe
a
6 or
rigorous
7, but not 8.
not 8 or 9. No, but they made it through a rigorous audition process to get in the group, which showed that they fulfilled a certain number of requirements to be in that group. It doesn't make them absolutely a better drummer than anyone anywhere else or at any level. It's just, yeah, I think a lot of the things that we end up looking for are so specific that it's kind of, yeah.
What are those things specifically for the groups that you've taught? Because we have been talking sort of in generalities and stuff, but we keep saying music's different. Each season's different. Do you find consistency in like, okay, at Blue Devils, at RCC, at Pulse, at Blue Coats, at Mandarins now? This is something specific that we know we need you to be developed in, good at.
I think if you asked this question 10 years ago, it'd be a different answer because of where the activity is.
Right.
And I think getting to like my lens today is shaped by watching groups when I was young, marching groups, and seeing various levels of like tension or different angles and different sound quality, whether balance was even a discussion from the staff or not, and trying to like mitigate all these tendencies that took place, like that I saw at auditions of these groups or that I marched in, and so now I'm kind of basing everything off of like, this is where the activity's at. Like we had this really like brute strength behind everything, and like if you go back 20 years and look across all the groups, everyone was beating the heck out of the drum.
Yeah.
Right. And if you look now,
What's wrong with
everything's
that?
way softer.
What are you talking about? What's wrong with that?
Hey,
Love it.
wrong with
We've
that.
already talked about resonance.
We're going to talk about resonance next.
Oh, do you want all these people going home with tendonitis in 20 years?
Nothing's
It's
wrong with
worked
that.
for me.
And now everything's way more fluid.
Yeah.
And my opinion is that like going in that cycle, we've lost structure to fluidity. And so for me, I think of, okay, how do we maintain this fluidity that all these students have tried to maintain or tried to grasp over the last 5 years of their drum career? And how do we structure that where it just doesn't look floppy and sloppy? Because right now it's kind of where it's at. If you look across groups, like, again, 20 years ago, look at West Coast to East Coast, it was drastically different. And now it's like everyone, there's left hands going everywhere. And so how can we, again, take their, because when they do that, when they're fluid and smooth, that comes with a soft grip, which is very conducive to an open, good quality sound that we want. But how do we structure how they move the beat? And so that's what I would look for. Are they maintaining this neutral grip that allows the stick to breathe and
What do you mean by
resonate?
neutral grip?
However you guys stand, hands at the sides, that's neutral. That's 0.
Okay.
All right, you have to hold. You don't hold the pencil with nothing. You hold the pencil with some grip so it doesn't fall out of your hand. That's neutral.
Okay.
And that's how I would define. So do they have a neutral grip that's going to allow their sound to speak and be resonant and also facilitate the shifts mechanically that we need to happen? So that's where I would look first. And the indication of that to me is how they move legato strokes, how they absorb their downstrokes, and how they absorb the downstroke out of a quick upstroke, like da-da-da. Like how are they stopping the stick after that? Or how do they do a full stroke out of that, da-da-da. Like that. that shows so much in their grip
Yeah.
because intensity differs between all of those things. And so, again, like that's what I would look for. It's how they're moving the stick and what that sounds like when they do that and what their grip is doing across all of those.
I'm gonna skip you, Danny. So I guess we can get to Connor. I remember some students would come to me saying, "I want to audition." This was, a couple years ago. I want to audition at Pulse or PAL, right? And I would watch them playing the thing, and they would. It was clear that like they watched videos or something like that, but their interpretation of the technique, I was like, "Don't go in there doing that." Let them show you. Sort of like get the information from them. Let them show you how that's being created, because all you're really doing is sort of mimicking. It was very like. Maybe back in previous years, a little bit around the time that you marched, where things felt, because you did this earlier, this is what reminded me of it. I had this one student who just did a bunch of this because they were like, that's the way Pulse plays, And then they went to auditions and they reported back and they were like, that's not the way Pulse plays. He was like, I was surprised how many engage from the wrist comments that I was getting in terms of feedback. Are there things specific, not generalized, specific to what needs to happen at Pulse that you feel like brings specificity to the technique more than just being like holistically,
Yeah, I'll start holistic, but I think that what you're trying to address is like you said, stylistically or style or approach.
Yeah.
I think that is like the identity of a group. I don't know if you guys would agree, but like I think that just to kind of give it a term, I would call it approach. And I think that the identity of the group is both a culmination of both the technique of how you teach, i.e. what like you have your set goals and what are you doing physically in the hands, fingers, wrists, arm motion, all that stuff, as well as the feet to achieve that. What are the tangible things that you're doing, i.e. technique? That paired with what has the book been given to you? What is the music that you get? And when you put those two things together, how would you take your technique and boil that down into the music you've got? How would you approach the music? That is your approach. That's your style. So if you were to say like, well, at Pulse, we turn the wrist up, we get a bit of arm involved, but it feels a little bit more natural or fluid to maybe break the wrist and come back down. Then you look at the music and you see, all right, there is a 4 counts of rest and then a big left flam. It's like, well, we've understood through our technique that like we want to look natural, we want to look fluid, and we want to feel comfortable. And maybe in the next exercise, we've said, hey, don't break past this 1 degree or something tangible that they can actually understand. And then they see that in the music, then they all understand that they would play it this way. And they all do a little bit of wrist break, and they all come back down because it's been taught or it's been discussed in the past. But it wouldn't have showed its head until it was printed on the sheet music. And I think the culmination of that example a million times over throughout playing the entire book over, past and present years, that's kind of what the identity of the group is. And I think that changes year after year when you get new music, you get new instructors, you get new students to come in and shape that identity of the group as it is in that one moment in time, which is why I see like, if I look back a couple years on how like RCC played, I think back to like 2006 and they are, it's like very wrist heavy. And then like, I started seeing the people that came into the group and like a lot of my friends who I knew didn't drum that same style, but they had maybe 1% tweak of that approach. And then you see the next year, like, oh, more people are auditioning for that group with that technique. And then it kind of, maybe morphs it into an image that is not like resembling 20 years in the past. Same thing with Pulse. I feel like we've gotten more. I say it all the time, but hey, we're not really casting spells here. We don't need to be Harry Potter with the stick over here and do any sort of that thing. But like, we can have a bit more structure, and I think that's honestly how the groups I've taught have evolved from my first year's teaching to where I'm at now.
Does that speak to? Can we talk about clean? Because we've talked about sound a lot. We've talked about having like a foundation. You guys have given people a lot of insight into the foundation that you try to instill in every player. But then there's clean, right? It's a little bit of what you were alluding to earlier. It's like prioritizing cleaning the show versus, and then maybe sacrificing that, having that sacrifice some things. I would venture to say, this will be me saying it, not you saying it, that Pulse the last several years, part of why they've won back to back to back is because they've been really clean. And clean out the gate almost. Like, I know you wouldn't say that, maybe, from knowing the intricate. Pretend I'm stupid. Like, how do you guys do that? Is it a combination of, how you're teaching versus, and then in addition to that, success breeds a better quality of, it makes auditions more competitive. Like, there's more top line people, so you're further along. How do you get to that place where it's like it is so uniform, it is so much the same sound, it is so rhythmically together?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that I have the answer by any means. I think
but you guys have had a lot of success.
What is it, Connor?
Doing what is the secret? Please, please.
I don't know. Like I say that because I don't know the answers. I don't know exactly what causes it, but I'd like to think that at least what we've done, I can tell you historically what had happened on those seasons was auditions came up and we made sure that we did our due diligence and vetted all the people to make sure, are they capable of doing these skill sets that we need them to? Can they, do they have reflex and play good rhythms? Are they good with their ears? And can they do all this while they're marching? And then, when we set the line, we're like, all right, like the skill level's pretty high. The first couple weeks, maybe we don't need to talk about how to play a full stroke, but we can skip straight to rebounded stroke. We just skip steps because I trust that these people know how to achieve this at a relatively similar stage amongst all people.
Yeah.
So it's almost like, I wouldn't say we're cutting corners, but we are fast forwarding the process. By the time you have spent, all the time you spent talking about those basic constructs, maybe that could have been a 3-hour cleaning session at the end of finals, working on the last little diddle or something like that. And you're saving time and putting it into things that like are going to jumpstart your goal to clarity a little bit sooner. But I would also say that like in my experience over the last 3 years, like it has been a huge help having the show kind of in its relatively final, I wouldn't say final form, but it's sketched
pretty
out.
well figured out.
Yeah. I think,
along.
by the time we are starting to, before December camp, before Thanksgiving even, we hear the show in its entirety.
Yeah.
And we know what it's supposed to sound like. And obviously it changes a lot between then and April. But not only that, we have high quality MP3s because, John Ian and the whole design team, they go to extra lengths to make sure that it's properly mixed because they want what the people who are going to perform this, they want them to hear their original intent when they're constructing these tracks. So we get such a produced track that we're able to kind of say like, oh, I hear the nuance in the track. Let me try and go for that in the music.
That is not surprising to me. Knowing those guys, the little bit that I know them, that they wouldn't just pop out an MP3, that it would literally be produced.
Yeah.
To give you to give a lot of information about how something should feel, how it should be phrased, what should be emphasized, all the nuance.
Yeah, and apart from that being discussed throughout the season too, I'm sure you guys also get that as well. Like when the designer comes up and says like, actually, I thought this moment it was cool because it lines up with this moment, and it kind of comes out of nowhere, and there's like a whole idea to it and all that stuff. Yeah. Sometimes you get that through the music. Sometimes they just straight up tell you this is what I was going for. But I think by the time we get to our first performance at the end of January, it's having good members and then having a clear pathway on what the music is supposed to sound like and what the visual idea is supposed to be. Are we telling a narrative? Are we not? Are we doing this kind of thing? I think when it all kind of comes together, getting a head start on all those things really helps.
Yeah, it's a real luxury of and that's where out of caption, like the whole design thing and the idea that so many of these groups at the top, just that experience level and out of the box earlier in the season, stuff is figured out better. And therefore you can spend more time getting it to clean, getting that clarity there instead of fixing the show constantly.
Right.
Like
that doesn't mean that you're still not trying to fight for every single thing.
100%.
Every weekend is always like, hey, you
Yeah.
can't just cruise through this season. Like, there's so many things that need to be done because you're not
up until
only fighting
literally
other
the
groups.
very end.
Yeah, you're not fighting other groups. You're fighting your group from a year ago. Can you beat where you last left off?
At RCC, you guys have had a couple of different people now designing the book. And before that, like Nick, for example, you had stability with who was writing your stuff, and which gave you probably a sense of comfort in, I know how to teach this, I know how to work this and stuff like that. Have there been challenges adapting to Rick's writing, for example, to adapting to Tony's writing, for example? And then Danny, like you brought for a couple of seasons, you're teaching to teaching other groups, like, teaching Crossman, teaching Blue Stars, which I think was that your Rick or was that your Tony?
That was Tony.
That was Tony.
Yeah.
So even though the identity of the group is similar, it's not like just a complete pivot, there's still a challenge, maybe, I don't know, to the actual beats themselves and the skill sets that are being presented. Every designer has their own tendencies that they cannot help. Have you guys had to adapt to that?
Yeah,
At
I think
all?
so. I think a big part of that too, that adaptation process, is the members being aware that it's different and it being okay that it's different, and
Yeah.
being open to like allowing the music to facilitate a different style and approach for them as members. I think, like, say Rick's first couple of years, maybe people wanted to maintain this same way, but some of the writing was a little bit different, which as a byproduct makes you move a little bit different, and that's all right. Same thing with Tony. And I think the group is getting better, especially now, like it being fairly fresh and young but experienced, where they're just down for it, they're open to it, and I think they're going to move and look different because of that. They're not trying to hold on to something that was, and I think that was a big barrier for us for a while, where people tried to play. It goes to what we were saying earlier, like they're playing how they think they should play, but they have no idea what that was like. And so we're in this weird middle ground, like you're just choosing to drum this way, and it's not at all what we're trying to go for.
Yeah.
And there was resistance there. But again, I think it's better now.
When you get information, you are always, what are you using internally to constantly check that you're applying the information kind of in the right way, I guess? So what is your internal reference? Is it words? Like when you drum, words, you're actually seeing words in your head, and those words match the right words. Or is it a person? Like, are you trying to, like when Danny demonstrates something, even though he described it, the way he demonstrated, I can see that in my head. I know what it sounds like. I am going to try to reproduce that. That's how I am constantly checking myself. Do you guys notice, is that, I don't know, maybe I'm weird, but that's something that I've noticed with students, is that every student seems to have a different reference that they are constantly following internally that either works with or against the information that they're being given. I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's the same like kind of understanding as like a student in their math class. Are they able to learn by reading? Are they able to learn by like oral instruction, or are they able to learn by doing?
Right.
In the same vein, like when you ask a student to try and feel this way while they drum, maybe they'll do better by hearing those words in their head, or if you tell them like, hey, you need to pinch right here, and you squeeze their finger, and now they have the sensation of touch in their hands, and they can kind of replicate that same touch because they can target exactly what they're trying to do. Or it could be something as simple as like you put them in front of a mirror, they might recognize their issues and solve them way faster because they can now see themselves not from this perspective of their head on top of their shoulders, how their hands look in this angle, but rather from far away, where they can kind of assess themselves as though they were a spectator watching themselves in a line setting, something like that.
Yeah, I think the thing that comes to mind when you bring up like words and visualization of those things, we all use terms when we're teaching, and I think this is one of the things about like the marching percussion activity that shows like its youth, is that we all use the same words and mean different things by them. Take velocity, for example.
Say the words.
Like, not many people, I think, take that for the literal like physics definition of velocity with speed and direction.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like they're usually talking about a motion that you can see or feel or hear. And so like for like the years that Nick was teaching me, it was kind of these, not necessarily opposing, but for the sake of simplicity, like opposing defined terms of weight and velocity. And that weight kind of translate, if you're asking somebody to use more weight, it translates to allow your larger muscles to contribute to almost like a more slow, constant movement. And if you're using more velocity, that gets a little bit more into like the fast twitch muscles that can move quicker and give you access to higher speed.
Right.
But that's not the literal dictionary definitions of weight or velocity. And if you go across the country and have somebody that's teaching Rhythm X bring up those terms, they might mean something entirely differently. I think that's one of the contributors to the something we were talking about earlier, where like I'll have a student that says like, well, Nick told me this. And it's like, okay, well, I know Nick and the way that he would use that term. And I think your interpretation of that term wasn't in line with what he was actually saying.
Yeah.
And it might even be that like Nick defines the term to the kid, but the kid's attached definition of that term in their own head is already so ingrained that as soon as they heard the word, they went with what they thought.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of happens to all of us. So something that I think is important, and we've been talking about this with the RTC staff for this year, is trying to be consistent with our language, the way that we speak to our students. Because if two staff members, if I work with the snares one weekend and then Regwo works with the snares the next weekend, and we're both throwing around the same words, but we mean different things by them, then there's no way that our students can have consistent interpretation of those words.
Yeah. Philosophy, people who like study philosophy in school, they talk about setting our priors, right? Whenever we engage in a conversation, let's agree that when we say these words, this is actually what we mean, so that we can, and that's just for the sake of having a productive conversation. You know, a lot of times the reason why people disagree like constantly or can be in an argument that lasts forever is because they're not even talking about the same stuff, you know, and they don't realize.
They don't disagree. They
Right.
haven't even gotten to the point of being able to disagree because they're talking about different things.
Right, exactly. I have one last sort of wild card question. Do you guys have, is there anything about the information that you guys give specifically that is controversial? Like outside of, like something that is proprietary to you, where you go, I know if a lot of people knew that if they heard, oh, Connor said this, and it's something you say a lot, it's something that you use a lot, that everybody would be like, he said what? Do you guys have anything like that?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure we do. I don't know if
You
I
wanna
can know what
reveal
it
it?
is because I have no idea.
Do you?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
I don't know how much, like if it would make people angry. It's just something that it's maybe sort of a hot take, but also something that I think is, I think there's some conventions in the drumline world that I just don't fully buy into because
Speak.
of my own
Do
experience.
it.
So
Go there.
in terms of grip, so for video people, you might be able to see this. Audio people, I'll explain it best I can. I talk about the back of the hand a lot, and that has to do, in the left hand, that would be kind of the middle finger to ring finger connection on top and bottom of the stick. A lot of people emphasize fulcrum a lot, which is another one of those terms that we're not using the actual definition of fulcrum because that's
When you say a lot of people, because you're you're gonna hit me where
Yeah.
I'm in my thing too.
Yeah.
That's mine too.
In your thing too.
Yeah.
But when you say a lot of, what do you think the sort of conventional use in our activity, when people say the word fulcrum, what do they actually mean?
Most people are talking about, if you take traditional grip, they're talking about the webbing between the thumb and the index finger. And if you take match grip, they're talking about the point between either the first and second fingers, the index and middle finger and the thumb, or just the index finger and the thumb. And they're talking about that as being like your primary point of pressure on the stick. And I think that that is, like for lack of a better term, like BS. I think when it comes to the right hand, it's like you have more than just that at your disposal to use for good. So the reason that I bring up the back of the hand, this is something I've started doing recently, not with the younger students, because I don't think they don't have an opinion formed that this would go against. So with some more advanced students that have more experiences, I'll rebuild their grip from the back of the hand forward. So the first point of contact will be with their palm on the right hand here near the butt of the stick. And then I'll have them wrap their pinky around to the fingertips and go the other way so that they're thinking of the back of the hand as being something that is just as important as the front. And then on the left hand, that comes with, it's still going to sit in the webbing of the thumb and index first, but then the connection on bottom of the stick, the ring finger touching, and then the middle finger making connection above the ring finger, and then the index finger connecting with the thumb but resting there, not squeezing the connection of the thumb and the index finger to produce pressure. And where I see this apply most directly, I've heard this in a lot of like video clinics and master classes and stuff, where people assume when you get to denser rhythms or playing more notes on one hand, your pressure needs to shift forward in the hand or more toward your fulcrum. And this isn't something I've always questioned. If you watch me play in like Blue Devils 2018, you'll see when we're playing fours that like my pinkies are moving off the stick, my middle finger is coming off the stick, and I am moving more into the fulcrum. But over time, I started questioning, well, if my goal is to keep my grip more neutral, as Nick was teaching, if I emphasize thinking about the back of the hand, the fulcrum's still going to do what it needs to contribute. But if I have to play 4 notes on one hand, why am I going to use a quarter of my normal grip to do that when it's the hardest thing physically that I'm asking of my body? So I think that's what I would say. I have, I haven't like named it, but I have my students do this a lot, where I'll have them remove their middle finger and ring finger from the stick on the right hand. So it's just pinky and
front and back.
Fulcrum. And then on the left hand, it's removing the index finger from the stick. So you only have thumb, middle finger, and then the bottom connection. And so what it comes down to me, I think a lot of people open up too much in those spaces unnecessarily, and then they have to recover from them. And if you could figure out how to play fours while keeping just your pinky on the stick and having the front finger connection and then having your index finger off the stick on your left, then how about you just do the same thing but allow the rest of the fingers to contribute, rather than surviving by letting everything else go off the stick and just going with what's most comfortable. And so that's kind of my hot take. Like we don't emphasize the back of the hand enough if we're trying to say that what we're going for is a universal grip.
Yeah, same. I hate fulcrum. I don't say that. And because, again, what Danny's saying, it's been talked about with like squeeze your fulcrum, like fulcrum pressure. And it's always discussed or paired with pressure. And I have a little bit different take on this, where when I talk about pressure, I talk about it as a reaction from rebound. And my way of doing that is like having students put their sticks out in set position, and then me just pushing their beads up and then having them experience the sensation of the butts of the sticks pushing into their hand. It's like that's where you're going to feel pressure. And if I'm playing, low eighth notes, something light intensity, that pressure is going to be softer than if I were to play big, like higher velocity eighth notes. You know what I'm saying? So that intensity and that pressure feeling is a sensation that is a response from the rebound and not something you generate before playing a note. And that's where people go wrong. They're like, oh, I have to squeeze more for these fast diddles. squeeze, play, terrible quality, rather than how do I start neutral and play and manipulate my intensity behind the drum and my effort of that, and then experience that sensation and be aware of my sound and make those minor adjustments based off of that.
Connor, you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, and I do think that we have a disagreement because
Let's
I actually
go.
do
Yes,
very
Find
specifically.
out by the end.
I do.
Yes.
I would say, and forgive me if if I'm going down the wrong direction, but I'm all for hearing other perspectives.
Yeah,
but
same.
like the way that I go about it, it's not necessarily fulcrum for the point of main pressure, or the point of main pressure, but more so the point that you are like allowed to let the stick pivot, basically.
Yeah.
And I like to the opposite of what you say. I do think that like I put more pressure. I guess it's weird to say pressure, but that's where I grip the stick. That's where I'm, carrying, a lot of the what these fingers have the most contribution to the act of holding the stick, so it doesn't drop out of my hand. But I think of that in terms of these fingers because that's where the thumb is. If I think about it right here, all of a sudden I've got more grip on the stick, but grip in the sense of like more surface area. I am now losing the resonance that I can get from the stick, i.e. I'm cutting off the rebound that I'm going to be getting in response to the drum head itself. So I usually talk about trying to compress that point of where you're holding a stick for the sake of resonance. But that doesn't mean that these fingers don't do anything. Like I still agree wholly in the fact that they have contribution. They should be doing something on the stick. And I don't necessarily think about shifting that point. Like you said, it's not about shifting more contribution from this finger to this finger. It's not about moving it in the hands, but it's about taking that equation that you built on through each finger, call it percentages. Say these have a higher percentage than these fingers, or on the left hand, this has a bit more than, pinching between here. That's just there to hold the stick. But it's not about shifting that pressure around. It's about scaling it proportionally based off of what rudiment you're being asked to play. And if the main goal is consistency in your technique amongst all rudiments, then you might as well try and achieve every rudiment and skill set without having to do this a bunch of times, which, I do the same thing whenever I say like, yeah, why do you guys like drop your finger off? Like, I don't know if you guys do that.
Yeah.
I watch videos of you.
I have done that.
Yeah.
'Cause it was the young, like, oh, Miguel did that. And
Right.
Like, he's really good.
I mean, I watched
And,
videos
like,
of you when I was growing up, and I did that too. I'm like, oh, that
I
feels
had
pretty
students
good.
who've done
cool.
that too. It's like, I don't do that anymore, kids. Stop doing that.
Yeah, but yeah, that was one thing that like when I would drum with Glenn Crosby a lot, he would see me do this and drop this finger off, and he said like, well, why do you do that? It's like, well, actually, this finger feels more muscular than this finger, so I might as well do that. And it's like, all right, play a roll, and all of a sudden I snapped right back on. I was like, oh, I need both fingers to help me out with that specific skill set. It's like, so do you want to spend the entire rehearsal doing this on and off the entire time if you use it for some but not all? It's like, he's right. I kind of want to make it easier on myself because now I'm putting energy in constantly taking this on and off, whereas I could save that energy, be more efficient with my motions, and delegate that energy somewhere else where I might need it a little bit more. Say a part's faster, I need to put it in my forearms, or there's bigger steps, I need to put the energy in my feet, or something like that. But to your point, I do kind of see it as like...
I see what you're saying. Then I would just kind of ask. I guess my question is, so my goal is recognizing that those shifts with slightly different rudiments are going to happen and trying to minimize how much shifting is going on. And I think we agree on that. You don't want to see like this for fours and this for rolls and this for, those sorts of changes. I think one of my main reasons of teaching this way is because what I see a lot is when we play rolls, I just see this, where students have been told to keep their pinky on the stick. And that's what they're trying to do, not realizing that, well, that's because your pinky could be contributing something. Right now it's contributing nothing. So if I'm going to double the number of notes I'm playing in my hand from check to roll, and I shift this way, now when I stop doing that, I have to shift back to get back to neutral. And so that's, I think, where it comes from for me, is if my goal is to reduce the number of things that are changing, then it's not just about like, I want more surface area on the stick, because having less surface area will produce more resonance. Like, but if that's the case, then why don't we just
Will it?
play like this all the time?
Yeah, and one thing I do agree on is like,
No.
I mean,
No, this is what I was going to say.
But we
Here's
got to find that balance.
Yeah.
Here's what's funny, right? Is I love this part of the conversation. This is like, because this is literally the stuff that I will stop you in the lot or you in the lot and just be like, can we talk about this?
I'm like, I gotta go too, dude.
But sometimes when we are justifying our technique, we will fall into the trap of giving assumptions
Sure.
as validations. And it's funny, like resonance, we haven't even talked about resonance. We've said the word resonance a bunch. We haven't even talked about it. But something that I've been sort of led to discover because it was an issue with some of my students was, you know, this idea of I want to work on resonance practically. I don't want it to be a concept.
Yeah.
I want it to be a thing.
Yeah.
Like playing in time is the same as playing with tone, right? And the stick making noise, right? So I had figured out these sort of specific ways to actually work on yes, no, on, off. It's happening, it's not happening. Funny enough, something that I discovered along the way is that for the right hand, right? I'm about to like throw the bomb into the room. There are 2 points of contact on the right hand, on match grip, that are dampeners for resonance. One is the underside of your index finger. So when you see people doing this, maybe there is something happen with like density or like maybe it's taking away something, but what it is giving is resonance. Like you can literally, tick, 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 da, 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 tick, tick, tick. You just like literally do it on your own. And the stick sings when you do that. The other point of contact that dampens, like guaranteed. Here. You know? And let's get away from good or bad, right? Because maybe for phrasing purposes or like whatever, maybe resonance doesn't need to happen constantly. Maybe that's not practical, right?
Yeah.
But one of the things that leads me to sort of my hot takes, especially when it comes to like, I'll bring something up in a lesson and a student's like, what the hell what are you talking about? You know? It's stuff like that where we hear words all the time and we go, okay, but what is actually, like, are we actually going to do it? Or are we just going to like click our sticks to our ears and go, I want to hear that. But you're not actually playing.
Yeah.
You know?
I have a problem with the same exact thing.
Go ahead.
And it's this thing like click your sticks,
Yeah.
hold on tight, let loose. And it's like, great. That is great for, that's what it should sound like. What does it actually feel like? What are you actually doing?
Right.
And it's the finger yoga thing. Like, let's do this. Like, you're supposed to do this, blah, blah, blah. It feels this way. And it's like, what are we actually doing? What is the actual utility? Other than getting warm, how are you implementing that? We're getting like further and further and further with our accessory stuff that we do, that we're losing the target and what we should actually be doing and actually be feeling. That's how I feel about like the fulcrum thing, the pressure thing.
Okay, what were you gonna say? What were you gonna say about the fulcrum thing?
I thought I did say it, did I not?
Okay,
What?
so
What?
so can I tell you my fulcrum thing?
Yeah.
So I'm gonna go the opposite, and I am gonna talk about the fulcrum, but But the thing I do with all my students is the dictionary definition of a fulcrum, and I'm like, there's a reason why. There's got to be a reason why. I don't know for sure. I didn't look it up on Wikipedia or anything like that. There's got to be a reason why. It's the only part of the grip that has a name, and what a weird name, fulcrum, right? So whenever I ask my students, what is a fulcrum? And they go, it's they don't even really say where it is here, but they do say here, it's where I grab the stick and hold the stick, like you said, like where I hold the stick. And I would say, what is an actual fulcrum? What does it mean? And they would say it's a pivot point. You used that word earlier, like pivoting, right? And that's only part of the definition of a fulcrum, right? So a fulcrum, dictionary definition of a fulcrum is the point on which a lever rests where the lever pivots. So that's where we get the pivot part of it. But everybody lets go of the lever part of it. And I'm like, the lever part of it is, to me, once I came upon that realization of like, what's a lever? Like looking up a lever. The first time I saw a diagram, I'm like, well, that's the grip. You know, a fulcrum, if we have a stick, can I have a stick? Can you just grab me a stick? If a fulcrum's on like this side, right? Then when you apply energy on this side back here, because you're using the fulcrum here, this side moves, right? But these two things are applying counter motions to each other.
Yeah.
Right? And understand.
Sorry, get me excited because I have a hot take on this.
Exactly, right? So understanding even just the notion of counter motion, right? And realizing that the way the stick, when we drum, even before we hit the head, you know, like if you're allowing the stick to sort of wiggle in your hand and have its own weight and stuff like that, and you can feel the way it's interacting with your hand, even before you hit the drum on the way into it, you can feel it, for matched grip, push up into your fulcrum and down into your fingers. It's applying opposite forces into your hand in order to make this move at the speed and energy at which you're trying to make it move.
Yeah.
Understanding that, to me, is a useful application of the idea of a fulcrum, right? And then, so when you're building the grip, it kind of informs the utility of when you say, this is the part that everybody's going to call the fulcrum, but here's how I want you to use it. Here is what that is in the context of the feelings, you know? And when we start to move certain ways, feeling those two things, you know, constantly moving against each other. If you're not feeling that, like if you're just literally just doing this all the time, and you're not allowing this feeling of this, where it's like pushing up into here and down into here, then I'm not saying that it's bad, but what I am saying is you are not using it like a fulcrum, and you're not creating leverage. You're not moving your grip. You're not using your grip like a lever, like it's a crowbar or a bottle opener, or, you know, like golf, like we talked about golf. Golf is the same way. So my hot take that I hope everybody like writes a hateful comment about is that a fulcrum is not this. Mm-hmm. It isn't that. That may be, that's, you know, if you want to say hold the stick there, great. And if that's the way, you know, if that is what's necessary, fine. I have no problem with that. But don't say that's a fulcrum, you know? Mm-hmm. And if you are going to say this is a fulcrum and we're gonna build the grip, letting people know what is the utility of the different parts of your hand. To me, that's an essential. To me, that's basics. That's like an essential. And on your left hand, it's the same thing. Like the way, if you look at it, the stick is resting here, and the way the stick, and I always like to say the way the stick interacts with versus you interacting with the stick. The way the stick interacts with your hand is it puts an opposite force into your thumb that it does into the webbing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then if you understand those things, then that takes you to the other thing that I feel like for some reason people don't talk about a lot. Maybe it's because it's wrong that I'm talking about it a lot, but this is how the hands correlate to each other. So if those counter motions feel one way in matched grip, you can correlate that.
Yeah.
And actually, and I think I've shown you guys before, but the thing I do with every student that always makes their mind go like, what? Is that your right hand grip is actually your left hand grip. It's just upside down and backwards. You know, so hold this stick, matched grip. Hold this matched grip in your right hand. You know, so if you do this, I don't know if the audience can see that. But this matches this. This matches this. When the stick moves away from here, do it the other way. When the stick moves away from this part of the fingers on your left, it moves away from this point on. And those, when you drum and you're feeling sensations, those sensations should correlate if you want to be using your hands the same in these quote unquote different grips. And the real practical, like, I could feel like, oh, I'm so smart that I figured that out, you know? The reason why I had to figure that out was because I was solving sound problems. This whole like, oh, I'm pulsing my right hand. Why does my left hand sound so weak? You know? Who had mentioned the thing about thinking sort of down more forward on the stick?
I mentioned it as a thing that I'm not
Right.
into.
I actually, there was a student once that came to me because they were like, their roles were out of balance. Very basic kind of thing, right? Their left hand didn't sound like their right hand. And I said, so how are you thinking about it? And they were doing that. They were like, I'm trying to get a little more steep. Like I'm trying to get a little more like this into the head. And that's making me think sort of further up the stick. And I was like, but that's not how your hands correlate. And I said, really, if we use this sort of correlation method, you should think further back. You should think closer to the fulcrum instead of thinking way down here. Because if you're thinking way down here, that's the corollary to thinking way back here. And it worked. Maybe it was just that particular. I'm not saying this is like some magic solution, but what I am saying is having a more critical eye towards, this is the big lesson in all this, is having a more critical eye towards the words that we say, and just, because a lot of times we just say them so much that we start to lose what they mean, like we get further and further away from that. That is sort of what leads to these things that I feel like, when I tell students that, they're like, I've never been told that, and I feel like a lot of people would disagree. So I don't know if you guys disagree with that, but
I agree. I just talk about it a little bit different, but
Yeah.
I agree with everything you just said.
okay, cool.
Yeah.
There's one thing that you said that I would push back on.
Let's go.
Can I see the stick?
Yeah.
So I think if you're talking about the diddle, like they're trying to feel more forward on the stick, to me that only applies to the right hand. That would be further toward this connection on the left hand. I would argue that a solution, not necessarily to every individual, but to keep the grip more consistent, would be to do the opposite of that. And that if I'm playing a diddle, I'm not thinking about doing anything more here. I'm thinking about trying to keep this connection more constant and this connection more constant. I don't mean in terms of space. I mean in terms of contribution, that part of the hand is still contributing to what you're playing.
Yeah.
And that goes back to what I was saying before of if we decide to play more notes by increasing pressure on one part of the stick, rather than just allowing the stick to bounce 2 times in this connection back here, that's a very minor adjustment in pressure back here versus a pretty large adjustment in pressure up here. If I make that large adjustment in pressure, I now have to recover from that adjustment in pressure to go to a different context. And so part of this also, I don't think anybody is not going to be able to play most music by using sort of more of the like increased pressure in the fulcrum approach. But for myself, that came out of Dave Glide's writing.
Yeah.
That I needed to find a way, if I wanted it to feel smooth, and if I wanted to take something like playing tap 5s at 200 beats per minute, you want forte accents and piano taps. If my hand goes into this every time I play a diddle, and then I try to turn my wrist, if you squeeze here, you can't turn your wrist, right? If I have this point of contact and that's what allows the stick to bounce, I have freedom to move up and down.
Yeah.
So I see a lot of people that just shift into this when they play tap 5 versus kick the palm into the stick. And if your grip is remaining neutral, then you can pull back to that height and it's fine. Most people respond by changing the book and lowering the accent height. That's fine too, if that works.
You do the kick the palm into the stick thing?
I don't necessarily think about it actively.
Yeah.
Like if you're playing tap 5s at 200, that's too fast to consciously do that every single time.
So in my example, if that's like something that's specific, right, a specific action, then when you have to do that on your left, would it be the same as kicking it into here?
Yeah.
So then,
Yeah.
so then the logic, like the rules.
Oh, it holds
yeah,
up
it's the same.
100%.
Yeah.
We've talked about that for years, like the parallels between the right and left hand.
Yeah.
And how you can use that.
You know what inspired me to come up with that whole corollary thing was Scott Johnson saying because it's one of the things he sort of just says at clinics. He's like, why do we hold our sticks differently? You know, and I forget what his answer was. It was like, because it was fun. But it was like, because it's fun. And come on. How often are people like, traditional grip is stupid unless you're playing on a sling or on a tilt? On a tilt. Or matched grip is stupid, you know? Obviously, those conversations are kind of toxic and dangerous. But yeah, like this idea of for some reason, my brain goes to, I'm not just willing to sort of, anytime the community loses its connection to analyzing the information that we're giving, and we just start saying the stuff because we've always said it, you know. I think it's healthy to be like, are we actually doing the thing? Is there any sort of last thing? Go.
I do want to talk just, the things that you had mentioned before about like trying to get in the weeds about the definition and the structure. And the thing that I feel like really sums up the point that you're getting at, which is like all that contribution that comes from the fingers. And the way that you had been mentioning it, like, holding like the stick, let me see your right hand, like holding it as a lever and trying to find the point that it balances, but also where is the counteract motion happening. It's like if you were to hold it on that stick right there and it pivots up and down like that, but you need a bit more velocity from this point because you can't be playing a stick with, that much, you don't have that much range of volume. So instead you pull it back, but now the mechanical advantage is on this backside. So how do you work with the counter motion? Well, you put these fingers back on the stick and now they're contributing to the stick. You know, I feel like that's kind of the point. It's like there are muscles that should be inherently used on every single part, and it's not on or off. It's not completely let go because as soon as this comes off the stick, it's more effort to put it back on the stick than to just keep it a little bit close, and you're putting all this tension elsewhere. It's not necessarily same thing with the left hand, but I do feel like that is almost semantics. Maybe that's where fulcrum comes from. The term fulcrum is because when we talk about this contribution from the fingers, that's where the original pivot point was. Now, of course, that definition has been bastardized because we've been moving the stick and trying to do all this other stuff. But at the same time, like, I'm not thinking about this when I'm playing eights. I'm knocking at the door. I'm hitting hitting a nail with a hammer. Like, this really only has to do with finger. But what's another way that I can come to a term that everyone will understand quickly and efficiently, and they just get it super quick? It's like, well, I call it fulcrum. Yeah. Because we've been spending so much time, talking about these universal truths that most people tend to agree on, and most drummers pick up on those terms. It's like, if we get too far into the weeds about, exactly what means what, and is this like the actual dictionary definition of it? It's like, yeah, not really, but we're drummers. We speak our own language, and other drummers tend to pick up on it. And if that is the most efficient way to give information to someone and have them understand the way that they think you mean, then the information's out there and they're better because of it.
There's something to be said about like a lot of why I like doing that with students is because I know they've never heard it before. And what's funny is just that. It's not actually like the specifics of what I'm talking about, but a reframing makes them look at it in a fresh way. Who else was really good at doing that was Jared Andrews. And it was funny that you were talking about building the grip from the back, like, is that being like a thing that you do? When I remember specifically Dark Sky auditions going into the 2014 season, he spent a day, sort of the clinic part of the day, and he literally did that from the back. You know who else tells you to build your grip like that? Golf instructors.
Oh my God.
We're back.
Round trip.
back.
Bring them back.
We're back. But when I and like that is something that I had always held on to. Like when I saw, because I was this front to back.
Yeah.
Like start here. And I think what was interesting about when you were reacting to that, you were talking about, well, then the stick would just fall out of your hand. But what Jared did is he would do this. Stick's not falling out of my hand. And I'm not holding it anywhere. So the stick's going to resonate. I'm not pinching it. I'm not holding it. I'm allowing the stick to have weight. Starting from that place, even though we ended up in the same place, like, and once we finished the journey of building the grip, maybe the grip aesthetically looked the same, but because it was built in a certain way, that made students look at it in a new way. And I will say, it's like every single one of these things. Have you ever come up with something and you were like, this is great. Like this is a magic bullet. I'm going to use this forever. And then like 2 years later, you're like, why did I ever say that?
It doesn't work.
Yep.
Yeah.
Definitely done that before.
Yeah. It's like, and I think the humbling aspect of that is kind of a bigger lesson, I think, should be made at the end of this conversation we're having about technique, which is the best things that we can come up with now, a couple years from now, we're going to think, why did we ever, which is why we always need to be checking it, updating it, so that we are doing our students the best. We are being responsible to them in terms of giving them information that is literally the best that we can come up with, given everything that we've learned up to this point. Not that we found it 5 years ago and we're never going to change from that.
Yeah, you don't want to rest on your laurels and just assume that what you've done has been correct. I'm constantly changing that thing. I'm going to take home tonight. I'm going to grab a pad and be like, well, let me see. Because I mean, that's, it's like you hear new information. You want to test it out and see how it applies to you.
Guys, I don't know about everybody else that clicked off this conversation a long time ago, and there's literally only us left, but I loved this conversation.
Yeah.
And I really, really appreciate you guys being here and having, spending your time to have this conversation with us. Is there anything you wanted to say before we sign off?
I have one little thing. This is like to maybe toward the like prospective student of like the groups that we teach. From the things that we like disagreed on, I don't think any of them would keep us from working well teaching a line together. Yeah. Like they're so like this is the minutia of like these very minor mechanical things that are ultimately preferences for the most part. So I think if you take like 80 to 90% of what we said, we're all just like in harmony, like, yes, this is important. Like this is important for students to focus on. And so I think before sticking to like one of those like really, really small differences that we're talking about, it's like, don't make that your primary focus in your practice. If your goal is to get to the point of making RCC or Pulse or Blue Coats or Mandarins or Blue Devils, it's like, those conversations come up like during spring training for like half a block, and then we like don't talk about them again because they caused a bunch of issues. Yeah. And ultimately, like our goal is still the same. We want to have the highest quality drumline playing with clarity at the end of the season. And I think, those discrepancies are going to happen between different instructors, not because they disagree with each other fundamentally, but because they've had some different experiences. Right. So yeah, I think that's the big thing, like disclaimer that I want to give to any student that's watching it. It's like, it's not that big of a deal for most of this stuff. We just like to nerd out about like this deep level of it.
That's not going to stop anybody from writing a really hateful comment about.
Sure. That's fine.
About
Hate on it. That'll promote it.
Yeah.
Anything, Nick? Anything you want to say at the end of this?
I think everything we said today was great, but none of it matters if the student isn't aware. And so I would say, like, my advice was in the context of being an ensemble or getting lessons, like, continue to ask why you're doing something, not in a defensive way, but to try and get to a deeper level of understanding and making the connections between your sound output, how it feels, what your effort level is of that, and what it looks like. The more you can connect that sound, feel, look, the better off you're going to be as a student moving forward. So yeah, if you're not aware about what your baseline is and how you're progressing or not, then all the little things you get told of rotate, feel this, do that, it's not going to matter. So I'd say pay attention and be deliberate about your practice and deliberate about what you're choosing to work on and get better at.
Connor, anything?
Same exact thing. Have conviction and understand why you're doing what you're doing. And don't be afraid to test your own, abilities or your own, pedagogic views on how technique or approach should be kind of understood. Because, like you said, and everyone's already brought up, it's like your mind changes really quick, and you find new and exciting ways to tackle the same problems. But to have those different pathways in like your back pocket, that's what gets you to be like wise and understand what all these other students that you have, all their different pathways, and how you can be the best teacher for each of them individually, not just one idea that you think you should be putting towards them and shaping them into that mold. But yeah, same exact thing. Just question yourselves and always be willing to experiment, be dumb.
Awesome. Here. Thanks again, guys. This was really great. And thank you to California Drums. These guys who literally have been sitting off camera going like, they really can talk about this forever, can't they?
Nerds.
Thank you so much for being a great host and allowing us to do this.
Yeah.
And that does it for this episode of the Drum Corps Coffee Shop podcast. Thank you to everybody who stuck with us this whole time. And stay tuned for the next one, which hopefully will come up soon. Thanks again.